You think you've won? I'll destroy you!
Take one more step toward her, and you'll answer to me!
You destroyed yourselves. I only showed everyone the truth.
I stood in front of 70 guests, a champagne flute in my hand, waiting for my husband to toast our 10-year marriage and his mother's milestone birthday. Instead, David looked me dead in the eye, gripped the microphone, and declared to the silent room, "You are a family destroyer." The crystal chandeliers of the Oak Ridge Country Club cast a warm golden glow over the ballroom, a stark contrast to the ice-cold dread pooling in my stomach. It was a Saturday evening in late October, and I had spent the last 8 months meticulously planning this night. It was my mother-in-law Margaret's 70th birthday. Every detail, from the imported white orchids cascading down the centerpieces to the vintage champagne flowing freely into crystal flutes, had been orchestrated by me. It had also been paid for by me, drawing heavily from the inheritance my late father had left me, a fact Margaret conveniently forgot whenever she boasted to her country club friends about her generous and wealthy son. I stood near the ice sculpture, smoothing down the front of my sapphire blue evening gown. I was 34, 10 years married to David, and exhausted to my very bones. For a decade, I had played the role of the perfect, accommodating wife to a man whose family demanded absolute submission. "Clara, dear," a voice purred behind me. I turned to see Margaret. She was dripping in diamonds, another gift from David, though the credit card bill went to our joint account, which I overwhelmingly funded. Margaret's smile was thin, her eyes darting around the room to ensure everyone was admiring her. "The salmon is a bit dry, don't you think?" she sighed, adjusting her silk shawl. "I told David we should have gone with Pierre's catering, but I suppose we must make do with what you managed to arrange on your limited budget." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. $45,000. That was the limited budget I had blown on this single evening to make her happy. "I'll let the kitchen know to check the next batch, Margaret," I said, my voice dangerously even. Margaret patted my arm patronizingly. "Don't fret. David always settles for less, bless his heart." She drifted away to terrorize her sister, Aunt Helen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Across the room, David was holding court with his brother, Arthur, and his sister, Beatrice. David looked devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo, the one I had picked up from the tailor just 3 hours prior, but there was something off about him tonight. He hadn't looked me in the eye since we arrived. He was sweating despite the cool air conditioning, and he kept nervously checking his phone, sheltering the screen from anyone's view. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was a junior associate at David and Arthur's real estate firm. She was 26, wore a dress that looked more suited for a nightclub than a septuagenarian's birthday gala, and had been hovering around the family table like a moth to a flame. I had always trusted David, even when his late-night client dinners increased, even when I found perfume on his coat that he blamed on crowded elevators. I was a fool, blinded by the vows I had taken and the life we had built. But a week before this party, a crack had appeared in the facade. I had been looking for our tax documents in David's home office and found a locked leather portfolio. David had carelessly left the key in the top drawer. What I found inside that portfolio didn't just break my heart. It shattered my entire reality and set the stage for the carnage of tonight. The clinking of silverware against crystal snapped me out of my memories. It was time for the speeches. Arthur went first, swaying slightly from the bourbon, slurring his words as he praised his mother's iron will. Next was Beatrice, who delivered a saccharine, tear-filled monologue about how Margaret was the glue holding the family together. Beatrice's husband, Greg, looked thoroughly bored, checking his watch every few seconds. Then, it was David's turn. He walked up to the small stage the DJ had set up, taking the microphone from Beatrice. The room fell into a respectful hush. I stood near the front, my heart swelling with a confusing mix of lingering love and newly discovered terror. I smiled, raising my glass slightly, playing the part of the devoted wife one last time. David cleared his throat. He didn't look at his mother. He looked directly at me. "We are gathered here to celebrate family," David began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "My mother, Margaret, taught us that loyalty is everything. She taught us that blood is the only thing you can trust." A murmur of agreement rippled through the older guests. "For 10 years, David continued, his grip on the microphone tightening, his knuckles turning white, "I thought I had brought someone into this family who shared those values. I thought I had a partner, My smile faltered. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. David pointed a trembling finger right at my face. But the truth is, I married a parasite. I'd like to thank my wife, Clara, for showing me exactly what a family destroyer looks like. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Aunt Helen dropped her fork. It hit her porcelain plate with a sharp, violent clack. David, Arthur hissed from the front table, though he didn't look entirely surprised. David ignored him. His face was twisted in a mixture of righteous fury and something else cowardice. He was striking first, trying to control the narrative. Clara has spent the last year secretly trying to bankrupt my mother, David announced, his voice booming through the speakers. She's been siphoning money from our business accounts, trying to isolate me from Beatrice and Arthur. And worst of all, she has been having an affair with my own business partner, Liam. Silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. 70 pairs of eyes turned to me, wide with shock, judgment, and morbid curiosity. Liam wasn't even at the party. Liam was a happily married father of 3 who had simply warned me, months ago, that the company's books looked strange. David was projecting. He was lying. He and his mother had orchestrated this public execution to humiliate me, cast me as the villain, and force me into a quiet, heavily penalized divorce where I would walk away with nothing out of sheer shame. Margaret was sitting at the head table, a napkin pressed to her mouth in a dramatic display of fake shock. But I saw the cruel, triumphant gleam in her eyes. Beatrice was smirking. They thought they had won. They thought they had cornered a mouse. But what they didn't know was that the mouse had spent the last 7 days turning into a venomous snake, and I had come to this party with my fangs fully bared. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could hear my own pulse drumming in my ears. "You need to leave, Clara," David said, his voice dropping to a faux sympathetic whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "Pack your things. I'll have my lawyers contact you on Monday. Do not make a scene at my mother's party. Do not make a scene." I lowered my champagne flute, placing it deliberately on a passing waiter's tray. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a terrifying, icy calm wash over me. The Clara who had desperately wanted this family to love her had died a week ago on the floor of David's home office, surrounded by bank statements and printed emails. The Clara standing here now had absolutely nothing left to lose. A family destroyer, I repeated into the quiet room. My voice wasn't amplified, but it carried perfectly. I didn't walk towards the exit. I turned on my heel and walked directly towards the DJ booth at the back of the room. The DJ, a terrified 20-something kid named Tyler, shrank back as I approached. "Tyler," I said calmly, "remember that flash drive I gave you an hour ago? The one I said was a surprise photo slideshow for Margaret?" "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. "Plug it in. Drop the projector screen. Now." "Clara, what are you doing? Stop her!" Margaret shrieked, suddenly losing her aristocratic composure. She half stood from her chair, pointing a manicured finger at me. David jumped off the stage, striding quickly toward me. "Clara, don't make this harder on yourself. Security!" he yelled, looking toward the heavy double doors. But security was out in the lobby, and Tyler, intimidated by the cold fury in my eyes, had already hit the switch. With a mechanical whir, the massive white projector screen descended behind the head table. The room's lights automatically dimmed. I didn't want to do this tonight. I projected my voice to the room, grabbing Tyler's backup microphone. I was going to file quietly on Monday. But since David wants to talk about loyalty and destruction in front of an audience, it seems only polite to provide the evidence. The projector flared to life. Relationship 1. David and Clara. The screen illuminated with a massive, high-definition screenshot of a text message thread. The contact name at the top read, "Chloe, work." The messages were highlighted in bright yellow. "David, just endure the old bat's party this weekend. Once Clara signs the post-nup Mom had drafted, I'm kicking her out. Then it's just you and me, baby. Chloe. You better. If I have to watch her pretend to be the lady of the house one more time, I'll scream. Miss you. Hotel 412 tomorrow. David. Always." The room erupted. Whispers turned into shouts. Chloe, sitting at table 4, went ghostly pale. She tried to stand up, but her legs seemed to give out. David stopped dead in his tracks halfway across the dance floor. That's doctored. She hacked my phone, he stammered, looking frantically between me and the guests. It gets better, I said, clicking the remote in my hand. Relationship 2, David and Chloe. The slide changed. It was another text thread, but this time the contact name was Sarah, Jim. Sarah was Beatrice's best friend, who was sitting 2 tables away from Chloe. David, Chloe is getting clingy. I'll buy her a cheap necklace to shut her up for the weekend. Can't wait to see you Tuesday, Sar. Wear the red thing. A piercing shriek echoed through the ballroom. Chloe leaped up from her chair, grabbing her heavy crystal water goblet, and hurled it directly at David. It missed his head by inches, shattering against a mahogany pillar. You lying bastard, Chloe screamed, tears ruining her mascara. You said you loved me. You said Sarah was just your sister's annoying friend. Sarah, sitting at table 6, buried her face in her hands as her own husband, completely blindsided, stood up and backed away from her in horror. Next slide, I said coldly, clicking the remote. Relationship 3 and 4. Beatrice, Greg, and the family trust. David accused me of siphoning money, I told the captivated audience. Let's look at the accounts, shall we? The screen displayed a side-by-side comparison. On the left, the Oak Ridge business accounts. Francia, on the right, a private offshore account under the name BM Holdings. For the last 2 years, the family business has been bleeding, I explained, pointing at the screen. David thought it was Liam's fault. Margaret thought it was market fluctuations. But Beatrice. I locked eyes with my sister-in-law, whose smug smirk had completely vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. Beatrice has been the CFO. Beatrice, care to explain why $350,000 of company funds was wired to BM Holdings, which then paid for a luxury condo in downtown Seattle? Greg, Beatrice's husband, frowned deeply. B? What condo? We don't have property in Seattle. I clicked the remote. A photograph appeared. It was Beatrice, walking out of a sleek Seattle high-rise. She had her arm wrapped tightly around a young, muscular man who was definitively not Greg. He looked to be about 25. They were kissing. Meet Jason. I introduced him to the room. Beatrice's personal trainer and the sole resident of the Seattle condo funded by your family's business. Greg stared at the massive screen, his jaw practically on the floor. He slowly turned to look at Beatrice, who was violently shaking her head. Greg, baby, no, it's not what it looks like, it's Photoshop, Beatrice cried, reaching for his arm. Greg violently yanked his arm away. Don't touch me. You told me you were going to Seattle for real estate conferences. You drained our savings to cover your tracks. He threw his napkin on the table in disgust. We are done, Beatrice. I'm calling my lawyer right now. Greg turned and stormed out of the ballroom, leaving Beatrice sobbing hysterically at the head table. David, momentarily forgetting his own exposed cheating, rounded on his sister. You stole from the company? From me? We almost had to lay off half the staff last month, you stupid. Don't you yell at her, Margaret screeched, finally finding her voice. Clara, turn that machine off this instant. You are ruining everything. Oh, Margaret, I said softly into the microphone. I'm not ruining anything. I'm just turning on the lights. And since you brought it up, let's talk about you. I raised the remote for the next click. The dominoes were falling, and I wasn't stopping until the entire board was cleared. Clara, turn that machine off this instant. You are ruining everything. Margaret shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her panic. She gripped the edge of the head table, her knuckles white. Next to her sat Richard, a distinguished retired judge and her fiancé of 6 months. Richard was a wealthy, respected widower, and Margaret had spent the better part of a year parading his diamond ring around the country club, boasting about their upcoming winter wedding in Aspen. Oh, Margaret, I said softly into the microphone, my voice echoing over the hushed murmurs of the stunned guests. I'm not ruining anything. I'm just turning on the lights. And since you want to lecture me about loyalty, let's talk about your upcoming marriage. I clicked the remote. Relationship 5. Margaret and Richard. The screen flashed to a new slide. It was an audio file interface, paired with a transcript of a voicemail Margaret had left for her sister, Aunt Helen, just 3 weeks ago. I pressed play on the DJ's laptop. Margaret's unmistakable, haughty voice filled the massive ballroom. Helen, I swear, if Richard tells that dreadful story about his fishing trip to Cabo one more time, I might actually suffocate myself with a throw pillow. The man is completely senile, but his accountant slipped up and mentioned his portfolio is worth close to 12 million. 12. I just need to endure his boring stories and his irritating grandchildren for another year or two until the stress takes him out. It's an investment, Helen. A tedious, wrinkly investment. The collective gasp from the room was sharp enough to cut glass. Margaret's face drained of all color, leaving her looking hollow and suddenly very old. She slowly turned her head to look at Richard. Richard didn't shout. He didn't throw a glass like Chloe had. He stood up slowly, meticulously unbuttoning his suit jacket. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying composure. He looked down at Margaret, who was reaching out a trembling hand toward him. "Richard, darling, please," Margaret whispered, tears of genuine panic spilling over her eyelashes. That was taken entirely out of context. It was a joke. Helen and I have a terrible sense of humor. "Take off the ring, Margaret," Richard said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the nearest guests flinch. "Richard, no. Take it off," he commanded, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Before I call the police and have you arrested for elder abuse and fraud, hand it over. Now." Sobbing wildly, her aristocratic facade completely obliterated, Margaret wrenched the massive diamond off her finger and dropped it into Richard's open palm. He slipped it into his pocket, gave me a brief, respectful nod of acknowledgement, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. Margaret collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her arms, wailing. "5 relationships down," I murmured, pulling the microphone closer. "But we aren't quite finished. Arthur, David's older brother, practically jumped out of his skin. He had been slowly inching toward the side exit, abandoning his weeping mother and his disgraced sister. Arthur was the golden boy of the family. He was the senior partner at the real estate firm, a deacon at their church, and married to Penelope, a sweet, quiet woman who came from old money. Penelope was sitting at table 3, looking bewildered and terrified as she watched the family implode around her. "Sit down, Arthur," I instructed. Arthur froze, his face glistening with a heavy layer of nervous sweat. "Clara, listen to me," he stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "David's a fool. He's a cheating idiot, and we all know it. I had nothing to do with what he said to you tonight. Please, let's just calm down and handle this privately." "Privately?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Like how you privately handled Penelope's childhood home?" Penelope's head snapped up. "What? Clara, what are you talking about?" I clicked the remote. Relationship 6, Arthur and Penelope. The massive projector displayed a scanned legal document. It was a second mortgage application for a house located on Elm Street, the house Penelope had inherited from her late grandparents, the house that was entirely in her name. "For the last 6 months, Arthur has been playing the righteous senior partner," I told the room, looking directly at Penelope, whose eyes were darting rapidly across the text on the screen. "But Arthur has a terrible gambling problem. Sports betting, mostly. When he blew through his own savings, he forged your signature, Penelope. He took out a $300,000 second mortgage on your grandmother's house to pay off a bookie operating out of Chicago." "No," Penelope breathed, standing up. Her hands were shaking violently. "No, Arthur, tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't touch my grandmother's house." Arthur couldn't look her in the eye. He looked at the floor, his face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "Penny, I was going to win it back. I had a sure thing on the playoffs. I just needed liquidity. I was going to pay it off before you ever found out." "You forged my name?" Penelope screamed, her quiet demeanor vanishing in an instant. She grabbed her heavy clutch purse and swung it with all her might, striking Arthur squarely in the chest. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. "I'm calling the police," Penelope cried, stepping over the fallen chair. "I am pressing charges for forgery, and I am filing for divorce the second the courthouse opens. Do not ever speak to me again." She turned and ran from the ballroom, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. Arthur stared after her, completely ruined. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with absolute hatred. But he had no power here. None of them did. I looked at the remaining guests. The room was practically vibrating with tension. Sarah, the woman David had been sleeping with behind Chloe's back, was still sitting at table 6. Beside her was her husband, Tom, a massive man who played rugby on the weekends. Tom had been staring at the screen since the second text message revealed his wife's infidelity. Relationship 7, Sarah and Tom. Tom slowly stood up. Sarah reached for his hand, sobbing uncontrollably. Tommy, please, it was a mistake. It meant nothing. He manipulated me. Tom looked down at her with utter disgust. You told me you were going to a grief counseling group on Tuesdays, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. You used my dead brother's name as an excuse to go sleep with David. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just pulled his car keys out of his pocket, tossed his wedding band onto the pristine white tablecloth, and walked out of the double doors. Sarah chased after him, wailing his name, her cries fading down the hallway. I took a deep breath. 7 relationships completely obliterated in under 10 minutes. The Oak Ridge Country Club had never seen a massacre quite like this, but there was still one loose end in the room. The ballroom was descending into absolute chaos. Guests were standing up, whispering frantically to one another, gathering their coats, and preparing to flee the disaster zone. The DJ, Tyler, was huddled in the corner of his booth, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Margaret was still sobbing at the head table, her face buried in her arms. Arthur was sitting on the floor where Penelope had struck him, staring blankly at the wall. Beatrice was drinking straight from a bottle of champagne, her makeup running down her face in thick, black streaks. And then there was David. My soon-to-be ex-husband was standing in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by the shattered glass of the goblet Chloe had thrown at him. He looked like a cornered animal. His perfect hair was disheveled, his custom tuxedo suddenly looking cheap and wrinkled. He realized, finally, that his entire world had just been burned to the ground, and I was the one holding the match. But David was a narcissist, and narcissists never go down without a fight. You crazy bitch, David roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. He lunged toward me, his hands balled into tight fists. He never made it. Before I could even brace myself, Paul stepped in front of him. Paul was a quiet, mild-mannered accountant who worked at David's firm. He was also Chloe's fiancé. Relationship 8, Chloe and Paul. Paul had been sitting silently at table 4 this entire time, absorbing the reality that the woman he was supposed to marry next spring had been sleeping with their boss. As David charged toward me, Paul shoved him backward with surprising force. Don't you take another step toward her, David, Paul warned, his voice dangerously low. Chloe, who had been crying quietly at her table, looked up. Paul, baby, please. Let's just go home. Let's talk about this. Paul turned to look at Chloe, his expression utterly detached. There is no home, Chloe. I'm packing my things tonight. I'm leaving the keys on the counter. Don't contact my family, and don't bother coming into the office on Monday. I've already forwarded those texts to Human Resources. You're done. Chloe let out a devastated sob and buried her face in her hands. 8 relationships. The carnage was complete. David scrambled to his feet, ignoring Paul, glaring over his shoulder directly at me. You think you've won, Clara? He spat, his chest heaving. You think embarrassing me in front of these people changes anything? You still have to deal with my lawyers. You're still walking away with nothing. Mom had that post-nuptial agreement airtight. You get exactly 0 from the business. I smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed smile. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 10 years had completely vanished. Oh, David, you really should pay closer attention to the business accounts, I said softly into the microphone. Not just Beatrice's embezzlement, the operating capital. David frowned, his bravado faltering for a second. What are you talking about? Did you honestly think I didn't secure my own assets before I did this? I asked, tilting my head. For the last 10 years, my inheritance has been the primary financial backbone of your firm. I funded the payroll when your deals fell through. I paid for this party. I paid for your mother's lifestyle. I lifted the clicker one last time. The final slide appeared on the screen. It was a bank confirmation notice, dated 3 days prior. Last Wednesday, my legal team officially dissolved my financial ties to the firm, I explained, my voice ringing out clear and steady. I pulled my entire capital investment out. Every single penny I put in over the last decade has been legally retracted into an ironclad blind trust. The business accounts are currently overdrawn. You can't make payroll on Friday, David. You can't even afford the caterers for tonight. You are entirely, comprehensively bankrupt. David stared at the massive numbers on the screen. His jaw dropped. He looked like he had been physically struck by a freight train. You stole my money? No, I corrected him. I took my money back. Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A man in a plain gray suit walked in. He wasn't a guest. He carried a thick manila envelope. He walked directly up to David, stepping carefully over the shattered glass. David Miller? The man asked. David blinked, completely dazed. Yes? The man pressed the thick envelope against David's chest. You've been served. The man turned and walked out just as quickly as he had appeared. I placed the microphone down on the DJ's table. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't offer any parting words of wisdom or dramatic final insults. They had destroyed themselves. I merely provided the mirrors. I picked up the hem of my sapphire gown and walked out of the ballroom. Nobody tried to stop me. The guests parted like the Red Sea, staring at me in awe, shock, and absolute silence. I walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club and into the crisp, cool October night. The valet brought my car around. I tipped him $50, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away from the wreckage of my past. For the first time in a decade, I took a deep breath, looked at the road ahead, and knew exactly where I was going. I woke up on Sunday morning in a sunlit penthouse suite at the Four Seasons downtown, a stark contrast to the oppressive, heavy-draped mansion I had shared with David. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't have to tiptoe around a man's fragile ego, nor did I have to mentally prepare myself for a barrage of passive-aggressive texts from a mother-in-law who despised my very existence. The silence in my hotel room wasn't lonely. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I ordered room service, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and finally turned on the burner phone my attorney had provided me. My old phone, which I had left sitting on the kitchen island of the house David and I once shared, was undoubtedly melting down. But on this new device, there was only one message. It was from my lawyer, a ruthless, brilliant litigator named Mitchell. The dominoes have fallen. The business accounts are frozen. Check your email for the filings. Enjoy your Sunday, Clara. Monday morning was when the real shockwaves hit the shoreline. By 9 a.m., David and Arthur's prestigious real estate firm was officially a crime scene of financial ruin. With my capital entirely withdrawn into a protected blind trust, a move Mitchell had orchestrated perfectly because the original investment was tied solely to my inheritance, not marital assets. The company had absolutely zero operating liquidity. They couldn't pay their contractors. They couldn't pay their staff. When the employees arrived at the office, they found the doors locked and a notice of foreclosure taped to the glass. Arthur's massive gambling debts had come due, and without the company slush fund to protect him, his Chicago creditors did not hesitate to pursue legal and highly public action. Arthur tried to throw David under the bus, claiming David's gross negligence and lavish spending on mistresses had bankrupted them. David, in turn, handed Beatrice over to the authorities, presenting the forged documents and the phantom Seattle condo as the reason for their insolvency. The siblings, who had spent their entire lives preaching that blood is the only thing you can trust, turned on each other like starving wolves in a cage. Beatrice's downfall was swift and humiliating. Greg, her now ex-husband, filed an emergency injunction and took full custody of their 2 children, locking Beatrice out of their suburban home. She fled to Seattle, hoping to find refuge with Jason, the young personal trainer she had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars to impress. But Jason, as it turned out, was only in love with the B.M. Holdings corporate credit card. The moment Beatrice showed up on his doorstep with 2 suitcases and a frozen bank account, he changed the locks and blocked her number. Last I heard, Beatrice was working as a shift manager at a chain retail store, living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Tacoma. Margaret's fate was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. For decades, she had ruled the Oak Ridge Country Club with an iron fist, terrorizing the staff and looking down her nose at anyone she deemed new money. But high society is fickle, and public humiliation is a disease no one wants to catch. When Margaret attempted to show up for her regular Tuesday bridge game, the club president, a formidable woman named Catherine, stopped her in the lobby. Catherine politely but firmly informed Margaret that her membership had been suspended indefinitely, citing conduct unbecoming of the establishment. Without Richard's wealth, without her country club status, and with her children facing imminent bankruptcy and legal charges, Margaret's empire crumbled into dust. She was forced to sell her sprawling estate to cover her mounting legal fees, downsizing to a modest duplex. As for David, his life unraveled with spectacular speed. Chloe, completely blacklisted from the real estate industry after Paul exposed her affairs to human resources and their entire professional network, packed her bags and moved out of state, completely cutting David out of her life. Sarah's husband, Tom, took her to the cleaners in their divorce, leaving Sarah destitute and forcing David to change his phone number to avoid her desperate crying voicemails. 6 months after the party, I agreed to meet David one last time to sign the final divorce decrees. Mitchell insisted we meet in a neutral, public location, so we chose a bustling coffee shop in the financial district. When David walked in, I barely recognized him. The arrogant, impeccably groomed man I had married was gone. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, his eyes carrying the heavy, dark bags of a man who hadn't slept peacefully in half a year. He was wearing a faded sweater, a far cry from the custom Italian suits I used to pay for. He sat down across from me, staring at the thick stack of papers Mitchell slid across the table. "You took everything," David whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. "The business is in receivership. Arthur isn't speaking to me. Mom had to sell the house. I'm living in her guest bedroom, Clara. Are you happy now?" I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering affection. Just a profound, liberating emptiness. "I didn't take anything, David," I replied softly, sliding a pen across the table toward him. "I just stopped giving. You called me a family destroyer. But the truth is, your family was a rotten house built on a foundation of lies. All I did was stop paying the mortgage. You all burned it down yourselves." David stared at me for a long time, his jaw trembling. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking, and signed his name on the dotted line. He didn't say another word. He stood up, pushed his chair in, and walked out into the crowded street, blending into the sea of pedestrians until he completely disappeared from my view. I picked up the signed papers, ordered a fresh latte, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. My bank accounts were full, my conscience was clear, and my future was finally, entirely my own. Sometimes, the only way to escape a toxic environment is to burn the bridge while you're standing on it, and let the truth light your way out. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you enjoyed this journey of ultimate revenge and reclaiming your power, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to know their worth, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and I'll see you in the next video.